This morning's talk is called The Air We Breathe. It was a response to the open call, the first year that Architecture at the Edge has had an on-site element to the programme, where we invited responses to the theme to explore the frameworks in which we live and work, the systems and environments, physical, social and cultural, that enmesh us. One of the recipients of the award for this year was a art and spatial research practice of Paula McCluskey and Sam Vardy, who make up a place of their own. They work on transdisciplinary collaborative research projects that critically investigate entanglements of geopolitics, art and climate crisis. They'll be joined this morning by Dr. Liz Coleman, who's postdoctoral researcher at NUI Galway in the Centre for Climate and Air Pollution Studies, particularly at MACE Head. Her research focuses on modelling air pollution and chief scientist in the development of the AirStream, or Stream air pollution forecasting app, which we'll hear a little bit more about later on. And we've got another guest speaker this morning, Akhil Scarf-Smith. Akhil is one third of the Resolve Collective, along with Seth Scarf-Smith and Melissa Haniff. Resolve Collective is an interdisciplinary design collective that aims to address multi-scalar social challenges by combining architecture, art, technology and engineering. Resolve has delivered numerous projects, workshops and talks in London and the UK and across Europe, as well as working with a variety of initiatives and institutions to pilot projects that introduce young people from underrepresented backgrounds to concepts in interdisciplinary design. So welcome everybody to The Air We Breathe. And first of all, I'm going to invite Sam Vardy and Paula McCluskey to tell us a bit more about a place of their own, how it was that you came to respond to the open call for the Boundaries Commission, and something about the actual proposition for the installation. Before we go any further, actually, I just want to say the installation did not happen this weekend as we had planned because of COVID safety restrictions, but it will be scheduled to happen in a fortnight's time. So please do keep an eye out to all of our social media and other platforms for updates on that, okay? So there you go, Sam, handing over to you.
Actually handing over to me, Frank.
Gonna go to Paula, okay.
Hello, welcome everybody, and thank you for coming on Sunday morning to this talk. So yeah, as Frank kindly introduced, I want to say thank you to Frank and to everyone else who's been involved in this kind of whirlwind of a project that we've been involved in. It's been really great to work on it, and the fact that it's ongoing is brilliant. You know, it's this weekend, but then it continues on. So I'm Paula McCluskey, this is Sam Vardy, and like Frank says, we make up a place of their own, and we've been working for the last decade on different art and spatial projects, which basically kind of look at the big global issues like border imperialism, climate change, and capitalism, but explore them locally. So we're very interested in working with local, participatory projects locally with people, but thinking about these huge issues, but how they interact locally. And we work with a range of media. We work with performance, film, installation, and co-produce work with a range of people. So this specifically interested us. We've been working in Ireland for a number of years now. I'm from Ballyshannon on the border in Ireland, and we've done a lot of work on the UK border in Ireland. So this is really interesting to us, the whole concept of boundaries, especially on the West Coast. But it was a different proposition, and what we want to look at initially is how we got from the boundaries and architecture at the edge to this idea of the air we breathe, and explore a bit about what we mean by sites of sympoiesis. So if you go to the next slide. Okay, so as Frank says, this is a specific call that we were responding to. So we just wanted to look at briefly what that was, because it kind of makes sense of the proposition. So we were asked to respond to the context of the recent debate around public space and how do we shape the public realm in a post-COVID-19 world, and who is it for? Now, this is interesting because we're not in a post-COVID world yet, and we're living with COVID, as we've seen, and this has been, obviously, this is why the festival's happening as it is. That is this combination of on-site and digital program, and also we should talk more about the installation, how it impacts the work that we do. But it was also an invitation to look at the nature of thresholds and boundaries and borders at every scale. So this was like an expanded ideas of the border. So it talked from the street edge to the geopolitical, from the manifest to the unstated. Consider how they are alternatively devices for identity and belonging, or exclusion and inequity.
So we were thinking about the question, the public realm, and it's something that through our work and practice and other things we considered in different ways. And we were keen to be critical of this notion of the public realm that is perhaps familiar, and that there are some dominant discourses and narratives of the public realm, particularly in an urban setting, that we see very much through kind of capitalist and developer-led, market-led notions of this. So we can see that the problem that we wanted to try and think through was these kind of how to break free from these kind of stifled imaginaries of the public realm, which importantly inscribe various kinds of boundaries and kind of oppressive restrictions and so on. So these kind of dominant narratives inscribe economic, racial, gendered, ableist, and other kinds of inequalities. And so it was in kind of contrast to that we just simply, in some ways, wanted to suggest the air we breathe as a way to think through public realm.
And especially, and I guess obviously, because as we're all thinking around, which we'll talk about more, about living in this moment of the pandemic, and how there's, in terms of geopolitics and in terms of how we think about politics, that it's the air and the atmosphere is something that it feels that it's been in there. There are thinkers and theorists and artists who have been working with the ideas around air, but I think it's given this whole, the pandemic has given it, has brought it home to literally everybody, the politics of air, and also the politics of air within the public realm. So, so we'll talk a bit more about the politics of it, because I think it's important. But the idea really came from a lot of work that we've been doing around how can we use art and spatial practice to, like we spoke about at the beginning, how can we use it to reimagine the world that we live in, to rethink and reimagine. And I think that's part of what we feel there's a kind of responsibility or co-responsibility as artists now, with before the pandemic, but now. But if we think about climate crisis, or like we talked about border imperialism, capitalism, all these other huge issues which are impacting everyone's lives, the huge inequalities, continuous war, all these issues, that through A Place of Their Own we've been trying to explore how can the arts kind of prise open new imaginaries. And this feels like it's a very prescient issues for a lot of how artists are working with the kind of the politics and the everyday of the current moment, and to sort of think about how can we collectively reimagine alternate futures to the one that feels sometimes that it's already feels that it's almost kind of predetermined, and it's so it's part of that kind of thinking as a method to rethink concept or phenomena in a way that can open up new imaginaries. So the idea was about suggesting a kind of the public realm of as a place of coexistence and co-production.
So when we think about the breath, the human breath, we came across this knowledge that this estimation that humans breathe in between 100,000 and 1 million microbes each day, around 1,000 different species of bacteria and fungi. And this really led us to just start thinking about how we are always in this kind of perpetual state of coexistence. The cells in our bodies as humans, the cells of microbes outweigh our own cells. And so this kind of question about coexistence and co-production actually it can be thought about through the breath in that way. And the American biologist Lynn Margulis called this the intimacy of strangers, which was a phrase that really stuck with us in terms of thinking about the public realm and how we might think about it in that kind of way. So this led us to this notion of public realm as a site of sympoiesis, which is a term that Donna Haraway coins in the book Staying with the Trouble. And it simply means, sympoiesis simply means making with. So poiesis is making, production, and sim is kind of with, collective. So we get this notion of the public realm of one not of defined boundaries of ownership, of control, and so on, but one of making with and coexistence and production. Now, clearly that raises many, many questions about how that might happen. And as Paula said, in this kind of ambition to sort of explore new imaginaries, there are different ways that can be done, but it always raises different questions, and political questions in particular. So just as the kind of last little bit of thought here before we go on to open up the talk to Liz and Nikhil, we just need to kind of raise some of those kind of political questions that this question raises.
So we have so this is a quote from the Nigerian writer and poet Telon Habala, who's this phrase, and it's actually in this country the air we breathe is politics, and that really so there's quite recently, like I've said before, that there's been this real interest in the kind of the atmosphere and the politics of the atmosphere, and the thinking about how different bodies and different spaces and different have a different relationship to the atmosphere, to the air, which is the call from the call that we responded to was, we were really interested, it felt important to us again to sort of talk about the inequalities and the politics of this. So this is this idea of this generative idea of sympoiesis and making with, but it's really grounding that in the complex and uneven and politics of the atmosphere, I guess.
Thanks very much, guys, for that introduction. I mean, I think it is very relevant, and there is a certain political element to it as well. We're certain, I think it certainly highlights sort of the inequalities that we might have had. It's sort of I suppose brought them more into focus, and that the people that are more affected by this pandemic. But I think what your project is, what I take from it, that it's more, some of us are more exposed to these, or we're more vulnerable to the potential toxicity in our shared air. And we can talk about shared air in lots of different, we can understand that in lots of different ways, or interpret that in lots of different ways. I think this might be a good opportunity to invite Liz Coleman into the conversation, and to hear a little bit about how you ended up working together, or how did Liz get involved in the project as well with Paula and Sam.
Hiya, thanks. Can you hear me?
Yeah, can hear you loud and clear.
Okay,
thanks, Liz.
Thanks very much for bringing us in. So I'm a postdoctoral researcher in NUI Galway, and I work in the Centre for Climate and Air Pollution Studies. And so I've been a scientist there for maybe the last 15 years. So what strikes me is very much is we're both really trying to do the exact same thing, to raise awareness of issues surrounding the major challenges that face our society today, which are like climate change and health via our air quality. So in the centre, but I guess we're coming at it from a scientific point of view, but it's just very striking to me that our overarching goals are the same. It's to reach our sustainable development goals, by bringing awareness to more effective policy. So at NUIG, we have a research station in Mace Head, which is right on the edge of the Atlantic. And we've been making measurements there since the 50s, measuring what contaminants exist in the cleanest air in Europe. So Mace Head is on in a geographical location where the air is really, really clean. So any air that comes, we're dominated by southwesterly wind. So any air that comes to Mace Head has come over the Atlantic. So most of the pollutants have dropped out. So that is, you know, it's pretty much the cleanest air in Europe. So we're measuring there what is in that clean air and what processes are important that might affect climate change. So for example, how emissions that come from the ocean affect the formation of clouds, and how this might affect the radiation balance or the energy, the solar energy coming from the sun, and will it accelerate or will it fight against climate change? So they're the type of studies that we're doing at Mace Head. But we're also very interested in air quality, what exists in our atmosphere that is harmful to human health, or harmful to the landscape, what could create smog, what are the chemical processes that create these harmful contaminants in our atmosphere, and crucially, how can we prevent the existence of particles and gases in our atmosphere that are harmful to human health.
Okay. Thanks. I'm just going to go back to Sam and Paula, because I know that there was a clip. And I just wanted to bring Liz in there to sort of understand the overlap or how you met, because there's this art science sort of project that you've kind of developed out of this, and it's become a collaboration between the two. But you've also been inviting the public to kind of get involved in workshops together. Is that right?
Yeah. Yeah. Do you want to go forward with should we skip forward to?
Yeah, sure. Yeah. Sorry, just a few slides here. Which
sorry.
Okay.
Okay.
In a moment.
No,
Yeah, no, it's okay. It's okay.
It's good. What we do, so building on this idea of sympoiesis, so this idea of making with, which we do across all our projects, similarly to when we hear about Keel's work with Resolve. You know, this it's kind of foundation to what we do, that we're working with different people on our work, and trying to really work with different knowledges. And for us, that does involve, which we're trying, this is something what we're doing is different other human knowledges, but also as we're trying to bring in these other kind of non-human knowledges. And just want to put that there because it's important to try and sort of disrupt this idea of the human exceptionalism. Okay, so for what we did for the proposal then came towards this idea of that we would have this installation. So we would sort of in some ways have this kind of this structure in the public realm that was on the boundary on Grattan Beach. And it would, and we wanted to involve these different elements of this. So we have mycelium, and we have some kind of, basically flora. So we have this header part of the installation, which will mean it will interact with insects while the installation's there. And we would and we have this structure at this part of the top, where it was kind of this ribbons where we can see the interaction with the air itself. But part of that as well was that we wanted to make some films and to co-make films with participants in Galway city and county. So put a call out for people to get into to come to workshops. So we've put on 3 workshops over the space of the last month, where similar format, where people we would kind of do a talk, and then we did some breathing exercises. So it was performative, and then we would ask people, and it was basically a film workshop. And the premise was that we would ask people to think about this whole concept with us, and for them to bring their experiences of the air from whatever their bodies, their experiences, and from wherever they are. To sort of reflect on that, and the invitation was that they could make a short film on their phones that they would then send to us, and we would incorporate within a film, which is part of the installation. So given, I mean, this is a way, I mean, if you know, COVID aside, we would do this with people, and we would work with people in people's communities, but this felt as a way that we could actually do this, given the restrictions that we're living in at the moment, in a way that felt meaningful. And so we were really lucky to get people to come along, and so individuals, and we did a specific workshop for Third Space in Galway, which we're really grateful for, because they really engaged with the whole idea. We're hoping to work with them in the future. Yeah, so do you want to say anything more about we've got a clip?
Yeah, no, got a short clip here, which is from, so about a 9-minute film was made in total, where we stitched together kind of parts of a film that we produced as kind of the art and in the project, but also including clips that were submitted by participants in the workshops. So I'll just play that now. It's only short.
Yeah, this is only a clip. That's just a very short clip from it, but you can see that has yeah, elements from different bits of films. That kind of, the method is kind of called cutting up and putting them together, and it follows, and it does follow a kind of, it doesn't follow a narrative. It's an art film, but it does sort of trace through the kind of ideas that we had for the project, I guess.
One of the really interesting moments in the workshop was when Kate from Third Space started talking about worms. So her kind of contribution to the piece was the worm clip there, and she really kind of clearly and well articulated the idea of the worms in symbiosis with the soil and with other life forms, in the way that they aerate the soil. So yeah, the notion of collective making with and co-production, coexistence and air was actually really clearly expressed in that video.
I might ask you guys, because I do I think that you know what you were talking about earlier about the mutual obligations we have to protect shared spaces in the air, and the slides that perhaps you missed out, which I suppose informed this. I mean, would it be worth to go back and have a quick look at them?
We will,
absolutely, yeah.
We yeah.
Just because I know that.
We just can run through these. So again, it is just about this idea of the uneven and difficult politics, the politics of the air. Do you want to?
Yeah, so it's just it was really at this point just to kind of give it, despite the short time of today and clearly not being able to kind of pay full attention to any of these issues, but if we're thinking of the air and the politics of the air and the potential of this kind of notion of symbiosis that it suggests, is also to have to consider these other kind of questions. So the politics of air pollution, I think something we might talk about with Liz shortly as well, as you just mentioned, Liz, which the recent California fires, this images of kind of raises questions about, and the broader questions of climate crisis. The question of racism across the globe and in cities and beyond is particularly kind of sort of poignant in this sense around the kind of the murder of George Floyd, but also many others in the UK and around the world, and where this notion of I can't breathe becomes so central. The use of tear gas in many situations is becoming increasingly popular. So whether it's in Hong Kong, this is a clip from the failed archive footage from Hong Kong protests, but we've got, you know, histories and narratives of tear gas being used in the Troubles in Ireland, so-called Troubles in Ireland, and in other contexts around the world increasingly. It also brings into question, you know, the notion of what Peter Sloterdijk, the writer, called terror from the air, when he talks about a book of that title, when he talks about how in 1915, you know, things really changed significantly when warfare started happening from the air with bombers and planes and so on. But the contemporary version of that, as we know, is drones and unmanned, fighters and so on. And then it really led us up to this question of the pandemic, which we're all experiencing, which goes back to the original call.
And all these issues are kind of, and I guess it's also they're not distinct. There's what we see is the interaction between them all, and I think that's what we try and do, is that a lot of the issues that we're trying to all kind of deal with are extremely complex, and how art and architecture and spatial practice can actually this idea of this kind of co-responsibility, or this care, or this way of how we can use a practice to be able to not just engage people, but to also like we say, this kind of co-thinking and co-imagining alternate ways to think through all the things that we're all living with differently. So
as well as the films and working through and this kind of bringing this symbiotic idea to the actual practice of the project, that worked in the films in one sense, but also through the collaboration with Liz and Claire Noonan at MACE Head. So MACE Head, which Liz introduced earlier, is over in Connemara and Clara. And so we were interested in this kind of co-production of ideas, or co-production of thinking through, the opening up, rather than trying to finding kind of, definitive answers here, but just working through together with physicists, scientists who were operating both in a global network of research, but also in this kind of rural setting in Connemara in County Galway, to sort of have that running alongside this kind of very local exploration in Grattan Beach in Galway City. So that was really interesting, and we were so grateful for Liz and Claire to kind of work with us on the project. So in the installation, when it's up in a couple of weeks, people will be, so that's MACE Head, for people who don't know it. That's the beautiful kind of very remote setting, and Liz can maybe say more in a moment about how that works. But this is the StreamAir app that they've made. So wondered, maybe Liz, you could just talk a little bit about how, we were really interested in the way that the app kind of makes complex data or complex information kind of really accessible. This is a little kind of screen grab of it, how it runs. So you can choose the different types of pollution or particulates in the air and gases and so on. But we're really interested in how it makes complex ideas accessible to the public. So we'll have a sort of a QR code, so that when people are in the installation, they can look at this on their phones or tablets. But could you say a little bit more about what this kind of tries to achieve, Liz?
Yeah, of course. So as you said, as I mentioned earlier, like, we're trying to bring the scientific knowledge to the public. Okay, so our work is public work. As scientists, we're funded by public bodies generally. So it's our duty and our responsibility to bring this knowledge back into the hands of the citizen, which is what we've tried to do with StreamAir. So StreamAir is a forecasting model run on clusters of supercomputers that we run in NUI Galway. So it takes the current data from Europe, from the operational models, from the networks, and we run them to forecast air pollution. So how air pollution is going to look in Europe over the coming days. But in order to make it, to personalize it to each citizen, not only can you forecast pollution over Europe, but you're also able to look at your specific location, what the air pollution will look like over the coming few days. So this is really important for people that are sensitive, like the vulnerable members of our population that might be sensitive to particles or ozone events. And it's also informative. It kind of, people can see how air pollution moves with weather systems that are coming in, or how it might be dependent on emissions that come from factories or vehicles. So it's informing the public and providing a service to the public, but essentially bringing the science that the people own back into the hands of the public. So that's what we try to do with the StreamAir app.
I think that's really interested in this question of kind of the knowledge as a form of public realm. So are you bringing the kind of understanding and the knowledge of the science, which is often quite inaccessible because of the time, money, and so on that is needed to access it. But to be working in this way and bringing that knowledge back into public realm, I think is really interesting, and actually aligns so much with the notion of the air itself in terms of public realm.
Yeah, exactly. And I think it's very important because like the knowledge does belong to everyone. And I think it's one of the problems with academia that has happened in the last few years, that it's become kind of ivory tower and inaccessible to the public. But it's very important that we can have conversations, because these issues of climate change and air pollution, they're like democratic, they affect everyone and vulnerable people in a disproportionate way. It's very important that we bring the scientific knowledge, the state of the art, back into the hands of the public and communicate it in a way that's accessible to everyone.
That sounds like a really good point to bring Akil in here. I think that how you just described that in terms of the way that the kind of academic or particular disciplinary knowledge is actually really, you know, the remit of everybody, but is actually behind these kind of various boundaries. And I think that can be really said of the world of architecture and the built environment, and public spaces in that sense. And I think that Resolve's work really directly kind of speaks to those kind of questions. So Akil, is this a good time maybe to introduce Resolve's work a little bit, and also your kind of response to this idea of you know, the air we breathe as public realm?
Yeah, sure. So I don't know if you want to whack up the slide. Oh, yeah, there we go. Cool. So I'm Akil. I'm 1/3 of Resolve Collective, which is an interdisciplinary design collective. We kind of use architecture, art, technology, and engineering to address social issues. A lot of the way we work is with communities, so kind of co-design and co-creation processes are kind of central to how we work. And we often work in a way that tries to use the site as a resource. So regardless of where we are or how we're working, it's about valuing and reappraising human and material resources from the site. And so that element of localism is something that we translate as to both a design philosophy and a kind of material approach. So if on the next slide is an example of some of the work that we do that appears in built form. So it's often using materials that we've kind of taken out of a kind of local flow, and then using it to create temporary platforms for like knowledge exchange. Within these kind of temporary interventions, there's often a programming element to it, which is as important as the physical element to it. And so programming and activating space for us is also part and parcel of physically designing it, which is why I think it's this idea of the air as part of the public realm, or actually any extension of public realm from what's physical, is actually a really important notion that I think would be good to expand upon in this session. On the next slide is just an example of some of the work that we do. So it kind of varies from graphic work and work that kind of is very much part of the built environment to, if you go to the next slide, physically active work. So this was one of the first projects we did in 2016, which was a temporary pavilion in Brixton. We're kind of from Brixton, Streatham, around those sides of South London, if anyone knows there. And what we did was to create a temporary pavilion that lasted for 7 days and 7 nights, but only from materials that we could source from within a mile radius of the site. So that involved a lot of negotiating with the built environment as a kind of ecology of materials, of human resource, and working to fit a design within the planning laws. For us as well, in this project, which became something that we continued to do afterwards, was that the programming of the space was as integral as the design. And so programming also became a way in which we would match planning requirements for having a temporary space in a public park. On the next slide, just another example of, I think, how when we think of public realm, or when we think of what's public, especially when we try and deconstruct this idea of ownership and public ownership, I think that's something that applies as much to the built environment as it does to academia. How we temporalities of publicness I think are as important. So this was a project that we did for a month that was within a kind of abandoned storage unit within Brixton under the viaducts. And as we activated the space and as we inhabited the space became more public. And the space took on an element to it, a kind of public facing element to it that it didn't otherwise have because it was locked away, it was vacant. And I think inverting some of these previously private spaces or inaccessible spaces and extending the notion of the public realm into those spaces, I think is also really important. And it kind of converges with some other things I think perhaps we'll talk about later. And then I think the final slide is one of the most recent built projects that we've done, which was outside Now Gallery in Greenwich, using construction waste from the design district, which is in the background, to frame seating elements that's part of a kind of programmable space which lasted for a week. I think what was important about this was that it was in privately owned public space. It was an intervention within privately owned public space. So again, how when we think of the public realm, as well as thinking about materiality, temporality, any number of different intersections as well, I think the question of ownership is not so well defined. And actually a lot of our public spaces, a lot of our public realm isn't owned by us and is still publicly accessible. Yeah, so that's us in a nutshell.
Thanks, Akil. It's really, really good to see those ideas kind of expressed through these projects and practices and kind of spaces and materials and processes that you're kind of working with. The thing that really jumped out for me in that was when you actually mentioned the word kind of ecology. So you were presenting these sort of architectural projects while absolutely talking about their materiality, and the materiality of them is clearly really important, you know, in terms of the resources of the site and you know, a very clear approach to that. But you're really describing them as this kind of dynamic ecology of different components of time, of activity or program, which is shifting and dynamic. And I guess that really aligns with this of the air that we breathe, you know, so rather than fixed and defined boundaries towards this more ecological. I mean, ecologicals are kind of I don't want to say overused, but it's kind of has different meanings, doesn't it? But to see these as this kind of ecosystem of interdependencies, and it reminds me of a phrase from a long time ago from Doina Petrescu from AAA in Paris, who's talking about a kind of searching for an architecture of use, not walls. And I guess there's kind of there's more than that in this, but something resonates there across this project.
Mm. Yeah, I really like that quote about searching for an architecture of use, not walls. I think it's really poignant in terms of what we do. I think to back to the air we breathe. I think when you kind of first introduced me to the concept, and I was kind of having a think, and I was wondering, okay, well, like firstly, like where's my relevance, and like how do I kind of fit in any kind of meaningful way to thinking about this, but also just what my kind of general thoughts were about it, and this extension to this idea of public realm. I think what I found really interesting was even the notion of air as public realm in of itself, and it's not something that I had, you know, like I think coming from like a more urban designy background, when we think of public realm, actually, like it's quite well defined. What public realm, what you're referring to, public realm, in everyday kind of like architecture chat, you wouldn't kind of present a building to a planning authority and talk about the air outside the 19th floor as being part of the public realm, right? So I think it's a really interesting extension. But what it got me thinking about were things other like that have broadened urban design in other ways. So there was an article in Migrant Journal by Konstantin Mitrokov. I think it's called "Seeing with Disembodied Eyes," and it was talking about drones in Moscow and how they've kind of and how it's normalized this new subjectivity of like seeing in Moscow, and how like now, because of the personal use of drones as well as the state use of drones, this idea of Moscow from the air, the aerial image and collective imagination of Moscow is much more normalized, alongside tons of other different kind of previously exemplary rules, or previously kind of rules of exception, that have now been normalized, I think, which happens with a lot of kind of technological progress, but thinking about these different kind of like gradients of law and of ownership and of subjectivity as vertical as well as horizontal, I think was really interesting. And that's something that I think when we extend the you know, essentially the metaphor of public realm to the air, we're kind of forced to think about, and I think that's like really interesting. There's a number of other things. I think lots of other things to do with like the use of drones, and you kind of touched on it as well, like the use of drone technology and the politics that comes with it. Even even like satellite imagery, a lot of the work that like forensic architecture do with SAR imagery and like kind of the resolution of satellites, politics over that in kind of occupied territories, and I think is really, it all comes into question when we think about that. But it also brings it in proximity with this idea of public realm, which is, you know, for a lot of people, it's about like planters and about cleaning the pavements and about making sure the bins are taken out. You know what I mean? Like it forces into proximity these quite haughty academic ideas and an everyday experience that all of us have.
Yeah.
I'm going to ask Liz about the same question, the same way that Akil responded there. I mean, there seems to be something about, you know, what sort of ideas did it raise for you in relation, you know, that Sam and Paula threw the proposition in relation to your own work as well? Because I think there seems to, you know, for Akil, it sounds to me like it's a reappraisal almost of working. I mean, has it sort of made you reappraise, I suppose, your practice as a scientist outside of producing research? I mean, you talked about it being public ownership. I mean, is that sort of key to it for you?
Yeah, that's a big, it's a big part of it. The fact that the science is public, and especially because I'm an atmospheric scientist, it really, the whole thing resonated with what we're trying to do with bringing science back to the citizen. But on a kind of loftier scale, what it really, what it really made me think about is the notion that the man-made boundaries don't apply to the atmosphere. So anything that we try and do in terms of, you know, for me, the goal for me as a scientist is to produce knowledge that will inform policy, that will improve the lives. Okay, so improve development. So for me, it reaffirmed that we need international cooperation to make any positive change when it comes to climate change or air pollution. So if you look historically, the first international conventions that took place after, like, around the time of the Cold War, that was like the birth of, that was when international awareness of environmental issues first came to the fore. And it just, them movements like the Stockholm Convention and the Rio Convention back in the 70s, they were the first to address the notion that we cannot do anything. Like air knows no boundaries. Okay, so pollution travels across the world. It doesn't respect international. It doesn't respect national boundaries. So the only way to address any of these problems is through international collaboration. So that is really what it brought to me as a scientist, this whole project, that we need to work together as nations to address the problems of our atmosphere.
Thanks very much, Liz. I think that sort of what Akil said about, you know, this extended notion of public realm, it's sort of for me, it's sort of central to the proposition that Sam and Paula proposed. I mean, we take for granted the air we breathe, but now suddenly we're in a situation where it's sort of, I suppose, the space, you know, whether it's personal space within a certain radius, you know, somehow, you know, has a value, I suppose, where public realm is sort of privatized, and that sort of has a value, that something can be taken away perhaps that is so vital and fundamental to our existence. And that's the sense that I got through, that there's a sort of a democratic deficit at the heart of this, and I suppose this is why some practitioners like A Place of Their Own and Resolve Collective engage with communities to kind of I mean, I suppose it comes back to why you do what you do, why you're practicing scientist, because you've a sense of this sort of duty of care beyond that just pure fundamental research, but also as artists or architects or creative practitioners. And I suppose I want to ask that question of Sam, Paula, and Nikhil as well. What drives the work, drives the research, and how does that connect to this sense of education and giving ownership back, because you're really not, you're taking something that's already existing, but you're sort of just involving others in that conversation, I suppose.
Do you want to reply to that, Akil? Because I mean, it makes me think immediately of your stuff in Sheffield with the connections to so many kind of different groups and young people, and the kind of pedagogical or educational or kind of transfer and sharing of knowledge and stuff that I saw in that project was incredible. But I'm sure in others as well.
Yeah, I think I'm trying to answer it succinctly because there's something I wanted to say in response to what Liz was saying as well. I think it's a fundamental part of our practice, definitely, in sharing and transferring knowledge, and also more importantly, actually, the revaluing tacit knowledge. So where we work previously for years, we only worked where we live in our neighborhood, which means a lot to us. And most recently, we've kind of been fortunate enough to work, across Europe, across the UK, and we found ourselves not being locals anymore, and being kind of an exogenous group, being in there, but trying to look through local eyes, and really, I'm seeing a lot of issues that happen in different localities that we recognise are very familiar to issues that happen to us where we are. And so revaluing tacit knowledge is a really important part of that, and that's one of the big drives to it. I think with the idea of air not respecting international boundaries, I think, and so in fact, it was something that Liz was saying earlier about academia having become this ivory tower, but actually this information belongs to the public. I think we can extend that public realm knowledge both to knowledge as we do to air, and I think that really that culminates with issues like climate change, which is something that like Liz was saying, affects all of us. And so that accessibility to that also needs to be widely thought about, but it also it extends to, I think it extends to lots of many things. Lots of universities are the recipients of public subsidies. It's the only reason why most people can go to university. The public subsidies come from us in one way or another. Not necessarily all from tax, but from a government that could only exist if we did too. And so essentially that question of belonging, I don't think it's steadfast, I don't think it's straightforward, but it can be problematized. We can think about, we can ask the questions like, should this actually just belong to us? Should this all be publicly accessible? I think I got asked a question a few days ago about sometimes when our art or sometimes when our work takes place within galleries. So like in Sheffield as part of a gallery, but kind of we've been in the Tate and V&A and stuff like that. And like how do you take community or co-design work like that and work it in institutions? And is there a way of negotiating the tension between that? And I said, there's no tension between that. There's the V&A is ours, and so is the Tate. If anything that receives Arts Council funding or National Lottery funding is ours, as far as I'm concerned. And so that there's not the tension is actually that we don't see it or understand it in that way. And I think that's that can be extended to which is what I'm actually the more I'm thinking about it, the more I'm really quite enamored with this idea of the air as public realm, because it really does permeate into and go everywhere, and it is everywhere, and we might follow that as a mental exercise and think about how much belongs really to us, how much is public realm, how far does it go, and like what happens when it extends across national borders? What happens when it extends across, you know, stratospheric borders and things? Yeah.
Thanks very much, Akil. That was. I think we're getting into the meat of this conversation, guys. I think, yeah, we're talking about ownership here, and we're talking about what's potentially been taken away, but so also reclaiming what belongs to everyone. And I think that was, you know, initially when the call out was made for the Boundaries Commission, and this idea of, you know, what COVID-19 kind of throws up, and the you know, asks of us is who's the public realm for, you know, fundamentally, and how can we reclaim it? Which with the installation that you propose, I'm really looking forward to seeing this in a couple of weeks. You know, will somehow communicate that in a very physical kind of way, because, you know, it's very hard to manifest, you know, the air. You know, research can often be inaccessible in some ways. I mean, I know the app that you've developed, Liz, is very user friendly, and you can see the movement of the air and that kind of thing. But how people, I suppose, connect it in a very you know, related to their own experience, I suppose, is through that understanding of ownership. That actually, if you talk about institutions, or you talk about scientific research, or you talk about any product of artwork, that somehow, you know, the process that's funded through, you know, means that it belongs to everyone. So I'm going to come back to yourself, Paula and Sam, just to maybe pick up on expand on that, and what Liz and Akil were saying about that. I see you nodding in agreement as they spoke.
Yeah, so I think, you know, I guess this idea of use, like you were saying, about this kind of thinking of the air like as this kind of mental, as a mental exercise, you know, where does it take you, and how can you, and I guess part of this project, it feels like it's kind of, it is still propositional, and it is like a co thinking about this as we go along. So this is one part of it. The films are part of it, the installation, and then beyond that. And I think it is this in terms of how to, in some ways, phenomenon. It is, I guess, phenomenon is about whether, because it's a phenomenon, so it's a material and discursive thing to think of the air in this way, as, you know, Karen Barad and this who talks about this for certain phenomena, and if you sort of think about them, you can make these different cuts in how knowledge is produced in these phenomena. So for us, part of what we're trying to do is to bring in lots of these different knowledges and different ways of thinking about the air. And we're only just literally, obviously, kind of scratching the surface. But part of it is to sort of raise it as a phenomenon, raise it as a proposition, and then do these different things to then see what happens, you know, to see what new knowledges can be generated. So the whole thing in some ways is the beginning of a kind of this idea, which I like, of this if you keep thinking about it, how far can it go, and keep and could be a different proposition, a different way, different people, or a different installation, or a different workshop, or a different site, that there'll be different ways of exploring this phenomena of the air as public realm. And I think that's kind of what I take from this. And it's another way of thinking about these incredibly complex, entangled issues. And we've talked about climate change, talked about borders, and the kind of things that we're constantly kind of working with across the years of our practice in different ways, because they are complex and sprawling and dynamic. And very local and specific, but also planetary as well. And it's just trying to find not a new language, but a new, new materiality, a new way of exploring, and a new, and it is about a new imaginary, really, which which I think that is the part of, as artists, architects, creatives, academics as well, that it feels this idea, again coming back to the responsibility, the duty of care, the co-responsibility, that feels really, that's what kind of drives all this work really for us.
And I think, yeah, just the only thing to say that resonated was that the need for the new imaginaries. So Mark Fisher, the late Mark Fisher, who I think he said that it's easier to imagine the end of the world than the end of capitalism. And so we kind of, a lot of this work is about just, because a lot of the question is about how to act, kind of what to do next, how to respond, you know, that our ability to have a response to the things that we see going on around us at the planetary and at the sort of body scales, unless we can think differently, like beyond these dominant imaginaries of carbon or of capitalism, then we're experiencing this kind of just mass kind of inertia, or kind of, you know, resistance to movement that many people are fighting through all the time, you know, in different ways. So just to kind of, through these discussions, the thought processes, the kind of that sense of it permeating everywhere, and trying to kind of think through it collectively, might just unlock little glimpses of how you might act differently next, I suppose, and rather than in a sort of a more traditional kind of architectural sense, let's say, which is maybe where some of these kind of problematic notions of public realm come from, providing kind of solutions. It's a completely different kind of approach in that sense. Yeah,
it reminded me of something one of our speakers said last night about, out of the ingovernable can emerge new world orders, and I think that's, you know, this art science collaboration is really interesting. And I know we haven't got a lot of time left, but I do, you know, talking about ownership, it seems like there's a sort of a sense of co-ownership in this project, Liz, is there now for you, and a place of their own? I mean, where do we go to, where are you going to next, and what happens next with this project?
Well, I'm very excited to work on the installation that comes over the coming weeks. But I guess in a more general way, I'm kind of heartened and, as I say, excited again, because to see how our goals very much align, even though we're coming from completely different places, completely different practices, how we both work, like, from an architectural creator, artistic point of view, and as a scientist, we're still striving to achieve the same goals, to bring knowledge to the public, and to stimulate some new ideas that can bring some solutions that will, minimize the inequalities that we're experiencing because of political regimes, because of capitalism, and industrial movements that are pretty much responsible for man-made climate change over the last 100 years. So I'm very excited to continue working with the artists and creators.
Great. We're really looking forward to seeing that in a couple of weeks. Akhil, was there anything else you wanted to add about just to kind of tie things up, I suppose, because we're right at the end of the talk. But you did talk about, this ecology before, and I think is there an ecology here that maybe Liz and Sam and Paul are exploring, this ecology of art and science, that maybe it's sort of, if there's new ways of working that, there has been overlaps in this kind of practice before, but should we be, in this time, is it more relevant? But we've needed to kind of go back to kind of look to kind of cultural and artists to kind of help us through this, crisis, I suppose, to help us understand it better. The scientists are giving us the facts and the information we need to, everyone's saying, listen to the scientists. The artists and architects kind of interpret what's happening in our experience. And how do you think, or what would you like to see as the next steps in this project? from your perspective?
I think from my perspective, I mean, the project is I mean, it's fantastic, and even the premise alone, that kind of interdisciplinarity is something that we champion a lot, and I think it's something that needs to become far less radical. The collaboration between the arts and the sciences isn't something that has been historically out of this world. It's something, you know, like there are many scientific professions that kind of arbitrarily incorporated draftsmen, painters, all these kind of things. It's historically you know, part of the norm, and I think it needs to be re-normalized, and projects like this are a huge step in the way of doing that. So seeing the project alone, I think is fantastic. I think that it's for where it goes in the future, and again, it's something that Liz was saying about the kind of public accessibility, and something that Sam and I had been talking about before, was really how you then engage with everyday people, and how you then reach and allow them to feel like they're part of this, and that not just the experience, but the information is claimable for them. And I think that's something that's happening as much in science as it is happening in architecture, and all these disciplines are suffering from, you know, ivory towerism, or whatever you would like to call it. Is a strange similarity in how we're all now at a crisis in which we need justification by everyday people. Scientists, the rhetoric of not listening to scientists has perhaps catalyzed this a crisis in which it now needs to be able to reach and be meaningful to your everyday person. Architecture is kind of obsessed with engagement and with co-design and participatory practices now, and that's becoming like really the call of the day. Disciplines, you name the discipline, and I'm sure it's going through a crisis of engagement. So I think it's really interesting. It's like that all these disciplines are doing that, and I think working in an interdisciplinary way allows us to share learnings from that first and foremost. But also just remembering that the things that are having these crises aren't God-given. We've constructed them ourselves, and we can just as easily make them porous and open that out to everyone else.
Yeah, thank you, Akil. That's a really good way to finish up, I think, because it really is up to all of us individually, isn't it, at the end of the day? I just want to say thank you again, big thank you to Sam Vardy and Paula McCluskey. I'm really looking forward to seeing what happens in a couple of weeks with the installation. Dr. Liz Coleman from NUI Galway, and Akil Scarf Smith from the Resolve Collective. Thank you very much to everyone for joining us today.
Thank you, everybody.
Thank you everyone.